Ava Carter boarded the plane with an air of quiet confidence. Her sharp, tailored blazer complemented the sleek dress she wore, while her natural curls framed her face, giving her an effortlessly sophisticated look. In one hand, she carried a leather laptop bag, in the other, her boarding pass. As she made her way down the aisle, her gaze briefly flicked over the seat numbers, but there was a subtle determination in her eyes. She was calm, composed, someone who had likely seen and conquered challenges before. Ava reached her seat in the first-class section, nodding politely to the passenger next to her as she stowed her bag in the overhead compartment. Settling into her seat, she pulled out a small notebook and a pen, immediately engrossed in jotting down a few notes. She was so absorbed in her task that she barely noticed the curious glances she received from the passengers around her. Moments later, Miranda Scott, one of the flight attendants, walked briskly down the aisle. Miranda's crisp uniform and sharp gaze seemed to inspect every passenger she passed. But when her eyes landed on Ava, something about her caught Miranda's attention. Her expression tightened as she slowed her steps, walking toward Ava's seat. "Excuse me," Miranda said, her voice polite but tinged with an unspoken edge. "May I see your boarding pass?" Ava looked up, her expression one of polite surprise, but she handed over her boarding pass without hesitation. "Of course," she replied, her voice steady and calm. Miranda examined the ticket for a moment, her frown deepening. "This is for first class?" she asked, her words carrying an undertone of disbelief. Ava's response was simple. "Yes, that's correct." Miranda's frown deepened even further as she processed the ticket, but after a long moment, she handed it back. Without saying another word, she turned and walked away, her lips pressed in a tight line. Ava shrugged off the interaction, returning to her notes as if nothing had happened, but Miranda wasn't done. She turned and spoke quietly with another flight attendant near the galley, casting several glances back in Ava's direction. It was clear that something about Ava had unsettled her, but Miranda couldn't quite place it. Not long after, Miranda returned, her posture now more rigid, almost authoritarian. "Miss Carter, could you step aside for a moment?" "I need to verify something," she said, her tone more forceful. Ava blinked in surprise, but she remained calm. Gathering her belongings, she stood and followed Miranda toward the galley. Whispers rippled through the first-class section as passengers exchanged puzzled looks. Ava, however, remained composed, her face unreadable. Once they reached the narrow space in the galley, Miranda folded her arms, her voice now cold. "I'm going to have to ask you to move to a different seat. There seems to be a mistake with your booking." Ava's brow furrowed slightly. "A mistake? I don't think so. I booked this ticket weeks ago, and it was confirmed. Could you double-check?" Miranda's voice dropped, her words sharp and whispering now. "I already checked. I don't think this seat is appropriate for you. You'll have to move to the main cabin." For the first time, Ava's expression shifted. A flicker of disbelief crossed her face, but she quickly regained her composure. "I don't understand. My ticket is valid. Why would I need to move?" Miranda's voice grew more urgent, her tone harsh. "I don't have time to explain. Either you move, or I'll have to call security." Ava's eyes narrowed slightly, but she nodded once, calmly collecting her things and preparing to leave the first-class section. The murmurs of disbelief and confusion from the passengers followed her every step as she walked toward the back of the plane. Despite the awkward situation, Ava held her head high, her grip on her laptop bag tightening ever so slightly. When they reached the main cabin, Miranda gestured to a seat in the middle row, her hand almost dismissively pointing toward the empty spot. Ava placed her bag under the seat and sat down in the cramped space, the small act of defiance barely visible in her posture. Miranda walked away, but the tension in the cabin lingered. Ava, however, remained unfazed, her eyes fixed on the window, her mind already working through the situation. She pulled out her phone and, with the precise fingers of someone accustomed to control, typed a message with deliberate calmness. Once she sent it, she smiled faintly, her expression unreadable. Back in first class, Miranda resumed her duties with a false sense of satisfaction. She checked on passengers, handed out drinks, and maintained an outwardly friendly demeanor, but her thoughts kept drifting back to Ava. There was something about her poise that had unsettled Miranda, though she couldn't quite place why. As far as Miranda was concerned, the situation had been handled, but deep down, she knew something wasn't right. Meanwhile, Ava was completely in control. She sat in her new seat, seemingly unaffected by the shift in her circumstances. She didn't let herself be drawn into the drama. Instead, she focused on the small details. A quick glance at the flight attendant in the main cabin, a younger woman named Clara, revealed the stark contrast between Clara's empathy and Miranda's coldness. Clara approached Ava with a soft, caring smile. "Ma'am, is everything okay?" she asked, concern in her voice. Ava looked up, offering a small smile. "I'm fine, thank you. Just a bit of a mix-up," she explained, her tone gracious. Clara, sensing there was more to the story, hesitated but chose not to press further. "Let me know if you need anything," she said, leaving Ava with a small glass of water. As the flight continued, Ava's calm exterior betrayed nothing of the storm brewing beneath it. While Miranda tried to go through her duties, her unease grew, a shadow lurking in the back of her mind. Something about Ava's demeanor seemed to defy the simple narrative Miranda had constructed, and as the plane cruised at 30,000 feet, Ava was already several steps ahead of the situation, plotting her next move. Just minutes passed before a calm voice echoed through the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we would like to thank you for flying with us today. We hope you're enjoying your flight. If there's anything you need, please don't hesitate to let one of our crew members know." Ava's eyes flicked briefly toward the front of the plane. She pulled out her notebook again, jotting down a single line before snapping it shut decisively. Her fingers hovered over her phone screen, typing one more cryptic message. "They'll call soon. Let me know when it's done." She hit send, the faint glow of her phone lighting her face. Ava looked calm on the outside, but there was a sharpness in her eyes that Miranda would have found unsettling had she noticed. Miranda, on the other hand, remained unaware of the far-reaching consequences her actions had set into motion. As the flight continued, the tension around Miranda grew. She exchanged words with Dennis, a more seasoned flight attendant, who looked at her with a mix of concern and curiosity after hearing the news from the executive office. Moments later, a phone call from the airline's executive office rattled Miranda to her core. "We've received a direct complaint about an incident involving a first-class passenger," the voice on the other end said. "You will need to provide a detailed report upon landing. For now, ensure that all passengers are treated respectfully and refrain from further altering seating arrangements without proper justification." Miranda's face went pale as the weight of the words sank in. Her eyes flicked toward Ava, whose composed demeanor now seemed far more powerful than before. She knew then that the storm Ava had quietly started was only beginning to unfold. Miranda tried to shake off the unease, but Ava's subtle smile remained etched in her mind. The tides had turned, and Miranda was only starting to realize the magnitude of her misstep. As the flight continued, Ava's plan was unfolding perfectly, calm, precise, and deliberate. And by the time the plane landed, the balance of power would have shifted entirely. As the flight continued, the tension between Miranda and Ava intensified, although it was a silent, almost invisible battle. Ava's calm demeanor contrasted starkly with Miranda's growing discomfort and guilt, which was beginning to eat at her. Every glance she cast at Ava, seated so composed in the main cabin, reminded her of how deeply she had misjudged the situation. The sense that Ava was orchestrating something behind the scenes, while outwardly remaining poised and collected, only deepened Miranda's unease. Ava's confidence was a force to be reckoned with. She was well aware of the power she held, even if no one else could see it. The way she managed the situation, never raising her voice, never showing signs of frustration, made her seem as if she were in complete control, and for good reason. Each subtle interaction with the passengers, like the brief conversation with the man who had asked if everything was okay, seemed to reinforce her unshakable composure. Ava responded with a calm assurance that only made those around her more curious about her true identity. Meanwhile, Miranda's nervous energy was palpable. Every task she completed, whether it was serving drinks or checking on passengers, felt mechanical, as if she were going through the motions without any real focus. Her mind kept returning to the conversation she had with the captain, where she had learned the truth about Ava. The realization that Ava had connections to the airline's board of directors sent a chill down her spine, and Miranda could no longer shake the feeling that she had made an irreversible mistake. Dennis, the more experienced flight attendant, noticed Miranda's growing panic. His earlier warning echoed in her mind. "You'd better hope you didn't mess with the wrong passenger." But it was too late now. Ava had already set her plan into motion. Miranda couldn't undo her actions, and the longer the flight went on, the more she felt the weight of her misjudgment pressing down on her. The moments felt like hours. Miranda tried to keep her focus on the tasks at hand, but every glance toward the main cabin where Ava sat seemed to confirm the gravity of her mistake. Ava was unbothered, and there was an unsettling certainty in her calm that Miranda couldn't ignore. The feeling that Ava was quietly orchestrating something powerful, just out of sight, was growing stronger with each passing minute. The final blow came when Miranda was summoned to the cockpit again. This time, Captain Harris delivered a blunt message. Ava's connections weren't just casual ties. They were with the very people who had the power to shape the future of the airline. Miranda was told to ensure that no further incidents occurred and to write a detailed report upon landing. The authority in Captain Harris's voice made it clear that her actions had crossed a line and there would be consequences. As Miranda returned to the galley, her heart raced. She could still hear the captain's words in her head, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was brewing beneath the surface. Ava hadn't said a word about the incident, but Miranda now realized how deeply she had misjudged her. Ava wasn't just a calm passenger. She was someone with the kind of connections that could bring her career and the airline into question. Dennis, ever observant, saw the change in Miranda. He leaned in again, trying to get her to admit what was going on, but Miranda remained tight-lipped. The weight of her actions was crushing, and it was becoming clear to her that she had made an enemy of someone far more powerful than she had ever imagined. The flight eventually reached its destination, and as the plane began its descent, Ava's calm smile returned briefly. She had already won. Miranda, on the other hand, was about to face the full weight of her mistake. Her career, and perhaps much more, would be forever altered by the misstep she had made with one seemingly unassuming passenger. Miranda's mind was racing as the officer's words sank in. She was too caught up in the tension of the moment to truly process everything, but it was becoming painfully clear that her actions were being dissected under a magnifying glass. The officer's tone had shifted, the scrutiny growing heavier with every word. Not acting like the other passengers isn't a justification for moving someone to a different section, the officer repeated, his gaze unwavering as he observed her. Miranda's heart pounded in her chest, but she could barely find the words to defend herself. How could she explain her decisions? How could she make them understand that it hadn't been personal, that she hadn't meant to overstep, to cause harm? But deep down, she knew there was no real defense. Her actions had been guided by assumptions she hadn't questioned, and now she was paying the price. I thought she didn't belong," Miranda said, her voice barely audible. It was an admission, but it was the truth. The officer gave her a sharp look, but remained silent for a long moment. Miranda could feel the weight of his judgment, but she couldn't bring herself to say more. How could she explain that it was a feeling, one that she'd acted on without thinking? How could she explain the feeling of unease she'd experienced when Ava first entered the cabin, that sense of discomfort that had clouded her judgment? And why had she let it dictate her actions? "That isn't enough," the officer said finally, his voice cold. "We need an explanation that matches the seriousness of the situation. You can't just decide who belongs where." Miranda opened her mouth, but the words stuck. How could she explain the complexity of what had happened in that brief, charged moment? The silence stretched on until the officer stood, signaling the end of the interrogation. "We're done here for now. You can think over your statement, but know that this matter isn't going away." As the officers left, Miranda was left in the sterile room, feeling a sense of dread creep up on her. The severity of what she'd done was now impossible to ignore. Ava had known exactly how to play the situation, and now Miranda was trapped in the fallout. Back at baggage claim, Ava's steps were purposeful and calm. She had already set the wheels in motion, and the airline was now forced to respond. Every step she had taken had been calculated, from the initial tension with Miranda to ensuring the complaint was lodged properly with the right people. She had already made her call, and now the company was going to feel the weight of her words. As Ava picked up her luggage and moved through the terminal, she didn't look back. She had orchestrated this moment, turning an unfair situation into an opportunity for change. No one would forget this encounter, least of all the airline. The wheels of justice, she knew, were turning, slowly but surely. Ava had played her cards perfectly. Miranda Scott, a flight attendant, faced severe consequences after her actions toward a passenger. Ava Carter were deemed discriminatory. Miranda had incorrectly assumed Ava was in the wrong seat despite Ava presenting a valid first-class ticket. Miranda demanded Ava move, an act that was not based on verified facts but on assumptions, leading to a formal complaint. Ava, calm and composed, filed the complaint and worked towards creating change within the airline. She wasn't interested in revenge but in accountability and reform. The airline, under pressure from the incident, announced they would review their policies and implement sensitivity and bias training. Miranda, on the other hand, faced a disciplinary hearing, where she admitted her failure to verify Ava's ticket and acknowledged her actions were rooted in prejudice. This led to her suspension and eventual termination, as the airline stressed zero tolerance for discrimination. Ava, while dealing with the aftermath of the incident, continued her efforts to push for change. She met with the airline's CEO, Richard Hale, who apologized for the incident and promised to overhaul their policies and training. Ava demanded a clear timeline and measurable results for these changes, signaling that this was a starting point for long-term reform. As she worked to ensure accountability, the airline rolled out mandatory sensitivity training, signaling a shift in their culture. Meanwhile, Miranda grappled with regret, realizing the damage her actions had caused. She wrote a heartfelt apology to Ava, acknowledging her mistakes and the need for systemic change. Ava responded, acknowledging the importance of accountability and encouraging Miranda's path to growth. This apology marked the first step in Miranda's personal growth as she began working for a nonprofit focused on diversity and inclusion, using her experience to advocate for change. Weeks later, the airline's changes began to take effect, and staff interactions with passengers improved. Ava noticed a positive shift in the atmosphere, with employees being more patient and attentive, a small but significant sign of the cultural change she had fought for. Even Miranda, now working with the nonprofit, had started her journey toward contributing to broader social change. In a reflective moment, Ava realized that while the fight was far from over, the events of that flight had sparked something much larger. She felt a renewed sense of hope, knowing that accountability could lead to persistence and long-lasting change. As she boarded a flight, she observed the positive changes in the staff and knew that her work, though challenging, had created a foundation for a better future. Change had begun, and with continued effort, it would grow, transforming the culture of the airline and beyond.